we're living in a time where the question of community and belonging is front and center for many of us right now. We're asking, what is community anymore? Where is it? Where do we find it? Why is this notion of community at this moment so hard for so many of us, both personally and in terms of the congregations we lead? And it's not just in our congregations, but in our larger society. We seem to be living in a world in which, let me use the language of soil. The soil in which we live today is one that doesn't seem to support community very well. There's a whole conversation going on in a book called about farming, in which it describes how the industrial farming has taken over so much of farming, where professionals come and they prescribe what we need, and they set up the kind of chemical fertilizers for the soil out of which the roots grow. And the result is that after multiple decades of this, the soils are desiccated. They're empty of nutrients, and the only way they survive is when these external fertilizers are brought into them. And there's a sense in which that's part of what we've done as societies. We've become societies driven by professionals who have professional answers and programs for us. But the roots of community, which are made up of our ordinary interactions with one another, have become very, very thin. And so recently, the New York Times wrote about a disease of loneliness that it was afflicting us. And that's a great place where we find ourselves at this point in time. So this search for community is not just in the churches, it's in our larger society. There's something going on, something has cracked. There's a fracture in the soul of our lives, not just as churches, but as societies. And in it, there's this deep longing for community. This has been going on long before COVID. COVID is not the cause of what's going on. There was a post on the Missional Commons last week that had the title, "They Are Not Coming Back." And of course, it was all about people not returning to church. What strikes me about that post is that it has had the most hits of any post on the Missional Commons since we've been around, which tells me that this is speaking to a deep anxiety. People are not coming back. And so people are asking, what is community then? Did we ever have it? What's been going, what's happened? And how do we move forward? What might community look like moving forward? Particularly in this space of deepening distrust and uncertainty and disorientation. So this is where we find ourselves. Now today, we're not going to be able to take a deep dive into this as a workshop. We'll talk more later about how we can go deeper and more engaged in this. But we can begin to paint a picture of what's going on and what's needed. And I want to do that first by sharing with you a story, and then inviting you into some conversations together where you can begin to share your own stories of what you see going on around this theme of community. So here's the story. And if many of you are pastors and have been pastors like I have, this story will make a lot of sense to you. What happened is that a member of the church died. And lo and behold, most people in the congregation didn't know that they had died, was not aware that this death had taken place. The result was that a lot of people in the church were annoyed that they didn't know. They were annoyed at the pastor that the pastor didn't tell them that this had happened. They were annoyed at the church that it hadn't communicated that someone in the church had died. Now, that's a little story, but it's a big story about community. And what this vignette tells us about community is a number of things. First, it tells us that the people of that congregation are actually not in the kind of relationship with one another that they think they are. Second, it tells us there is this expectation around who is responsible for maintaining relationships. It's the pastor, it's the church office, it's the programs that the clergy and the board create, its roles and responsibilities. Thirdly, it tells us that to a large extent, church life is built around events, Sunday worship, weekday programs, and that these events are run by the professionals and we attend them. That congregation is in many ways, it's about programs and institutions, not relationships. Finally, it's telling us that we've become consumers of religious goods and services, which is very different from being participants in the forming of a community. So that's a lot from a little vignette, but it's a story of what's actually happening and going on the ground. What I'd like to do is, out of these conversations, invite us to develop some perspectives around how we engage this question of community. And I think as all of us know, this sense of the thinness of community, of the difficulty in shaping it, has not come out of COVID. COVID has made it visible, but it's not produced it. The loneliness and the lack of connectivity that is present has not been produced over the last year and a half or so because of a virus. It's exacerbated it, but it's been there. And particularly those of us who are in leadership, which is most of us, there's some things we need to hear, I believe, if we're to engage this question of community and being God's people in the space where we are. The first is that this thinness has been a long time in the making. It hasn't just popped up in the last decade. It's the result of a lot of different things, which I wish we had time to talk about. And therefore, this thinness of relationship is not going to be turned around quickly. This is not an easy one. I find, for example, in my own neighborhood, that it's not difficult to cultivate lots of conversations in the back entryway, back alleyway. But if you try to step beyond those conversations, there's fear and resistance that we've built something into our life together that is almost like a barrier against community. The second thing I want to say, particularly to those of you who are pastors and leaders, this thinness of relationality, particularly in our congregations, is not on your back. It's not your fault as a leader that reality exists. And in fact, I would say that you are not going to be able to animate and form and shape your people in a different journey if you feel you're responsible, that you've got to make community happen. It's not that. It requires a different kind of leading. And I want to talk about that for a little bit and share some examples. And then the rest of our time is given over to conversation back and forth with one another. So let me take a bit of time and briefly do that. And without being abstract, I go very quickly to theology, which is another way of saying I want to talk about God in the midst of all of this. Because we can do all kinds of social analysis of what's going on, and most of us around this thing are very good at that. But I want to talk about something else. That the first thing I want to say is that is the obvious, is that God created and made us for community. That's in the creation stories, wherever you go, that's present. And so what does this mean? Here's what it means, and it's attention. I want to propose to you that the thinness and the sense of the loss of community, particularly in our churches, is itself a sign of our loss of a sense of God's presence and God's life amongst us as God's people. And I would argue that the roots of community in our churches are thin because we are formed as congregations far more largely out of the professionalized teachings and learnings of clergy and the programs that come to us. I find that we're much more focused on learning how do we do innovation or how do we do adaptation or whatever the program is. And we're not attending to the fact that it is as a community of people are drawn into transcendence, into the holiness and the transcendence of God's presence, the community begins to take shape. So that's the first point I want to make. And to me, that's a place of hope, that we do not have to be discouraged or despairing around the stories that we've shared, because God is in the midst and amongst us. And part of our calling and our vocation and our role is this rediscovery of transcendence. Now, we can go down a lot of roads in that. I would argue that a lot of our worship forms actually are barriers against transcendence. But that's first where we need to go. We have lost, and I'm generalizing, the core reality that as God's people, we are God's people. We are not programmatized around issues and everything else. Therefore, our hope in remaking community is not in our professionalism as clergy. It's not because we're good counselors, good preachers, good whatever. It's not because of those things. And we will not recover community by getting better programs that are coming down the pipe. It's in reconnecting ourselves and our people with God's presence amongst us. And that has to do with a lot of practices that we can talk about a little later. The second point I want to make around that is that because God is at work amongst us, here's what I want to propose to you. There are already going on in the congregations and the communities where we live all kinds of intimations and longings amongst our people about community. They just don't know how to name them. Let me give you some examples. A while back, we were at an event around this whole question about Luke 10 and joining God in our neighborhood. And a woman, a quiet woman in her, I think, early 60s, said, I want to share a story with you. And she described how she and her husband had planned this large trip, cruise, and their bags were packed, and they went to bed, and they got up the next morning to go on their trip, and without getting into all the details, he died in the night. And she was bereft. She talked about her church family and their care and their love and all of that, but she was bereft. And she found herself wandering around a house filled with the furniture of memory, but empty of her husband. And she knew that she could not live in that furniture of memory. So she started to get rid of the furniture. And for a reason we don't need right now, one of the iconic pieces of furniture in the household for the kids and herself was a big, big dining room table that the kids did not want her to get rid of. So what she did in her consternation was put it in the empty garage. And here's the story. Over time, people walking by on the street looked in and said to her, "What's that table doing in the garage?" Now, some of you know these stories because you do them. But here's the point. After a little while, there were people from the neighborhood coming to have coffee around the table in the garage, and conversations were breaking out that could never have been planned by a church council or a community organizer in the church. What's my point? My point is that right in our congregation, amidst people who never think that they could plan anything, the longing and the hunger for community and transcendence is present, and it's going on. A second story, very quickly. This is a story told by a dear friend of mine, Simon Carey Holt, who is a Baptist pastor in Melbourne, Australia. He tells a story of being an associate pastor in America and going to visit an elderly couple. And this elderly couple had been retired out of their roles in the church. And when he went to see them, they were feeling a bit bereft. They were feeling abandoned. They felt like they had no place anymore in the church because their roles had gone. And he was asking them, "Well, what are you doing with your time?" And they said, "Well, not much." And they began to tell these stories. Across the street, a Chinese family had moved in, and the young Chinese woman just graduating from high school was trying to learn English. And this couple, the wife of this couple, had gone over and had met her and had said to her, "I'd love to go for walks with you every day, and I will help you with your English if you will help me with your Cantonese." Right there, they were building community. They were shaping life out of the ordinariness of themselves. He said, yes, and he said, and across the street the other way, there's a family, and the husband had fallen and broken his leg, and the family was having a hard time helping him just get cleaned up. So this guy was saying, "I go over every day to help him bathe." And what's my point? What this old couple said is that they felt washed up and didn't have a place and a role in their church any longer and were dispirited. And Simon Carey Holt's point was, how did that church shape a life that the only way people felt they were important and involved is that they were involved in a program, when they're doing this kind of community life and building? What's my point? My point is that in the ordinariness and the everydayness, in all the anxiety that's going on in our congregations about who's coming back and who's not coming back, and what's the pastor doing and what's the pastor not doing, God is at work, and those stories are present. And the secret here is not how do we organize to form community, not how do we preach 100 sermons, or how do we create a small group Bible study guide on community. The secret is how do we learn, this is about transcendence, how do we learn to see God at work in the everyday, ordinary activities of our people? It's not about busy professionals creating things. It's about something else. What we would like to propose is that there are 4 characteristics or perspectives of leadership that are critical at this moment for the formation of community, both amongst God's people and in the neighborhoods where we dwell. There may be others, but there are these four. First, what we want to be, and you've heard me speak of this before, what we want to be is less and less and less professionals, ministers, preachers, program organizers, and become detectives of divinity. That is our primary vocation in the forming of community, is asking and looking at where is it that God is planting, that the Spirit of Jesus is planting stories and intimations like the ones I've just shared with you. And here's my guess, that in your congregations, many of those are already going on. They're under the radar, and people just don't assume it's Christian. So we become detectives of divinity. We look, we seek, we put ourselves in places where we're listening and hearing to where those stories are going on. The second skill that's needed is that alongside being detectives of divinity, discerning, we become midwives. One of the stories I told you, Simon Carey Holt's story, illustrates the importance of a midwife. What Simon had to do with that older couple is help them to understand that walking with that young high school kid and helping that man bathe as he healed, that was building the community of Christ. That was being a part of what God is doing in the world. Helping them to name what they were doing, encouraging them. That's the midwifing that we need amongst our people, because most of the time our people can't name that this is the work of God in the midst of the church and the congregation. Detectives of divinity, midwives who are helping to birth what God is placing amongst them. The third thing, in order to do that, is that we as leaders have to lay down our need for outcomes and results. Now, that's a tough one, because in most of our churches, most of our boards have been trained to ask, what's the ROI in terms of what we're doing? What we're talking about is the forming and the shaping of a community requires us to lay down our objectives, our strategies, our plans, to put them away. And I would argue, as easy as that sounds, that is a conversion experience for most clergy. Now, one of the reasons why we've got to put those away and lay them down, this is why inviting a church to become innovative or to assess its community, all those things are programmatized. And what they do is they objectify. And if you are objectifying in terms of what are the outcomes, what are we creating, how do we meet needs, if you're doing that objectification, we will not hear one another. We will fit into poses and programs. So that's the third thing, this laying down. The final piece, the fourth piece, is that in the midst of listening to the stories of where God is present amongst our people and in our community, in the midst of being midwives, helping to birth what God is forming, in the midst of laying down outcomes, the fourth thing that we're doing is in our liturgies, in our forms of worship, in our engagements with Scripture, we are bringing the stories of what is happening. We are bringing the midwifing that we're doing into these liturgies, into this work of worship and transcendence and praise. And it's bringing those four things into play that begin to give us as leaders some practices for the reformation of community. Now notice, most of what I've talked about is not do this in the church first and then do this in the neighborhood. They go together. You can't do the one without the other. We will not form a community of God's people unless we are ourselves involved and engaged in the community and the neighborhood in which we find ourselves. The one requires the other. What I've said is that these questions of identity, of community, and as we look next month, how do we make decisions, we can begin to dig into them in a workshop like this. But in the long term, in the disruptive space where we find ourselves, what we need are companions, as I said to Claudia, where we are looking at the real stuff that we're working with, not ideas. And we're begin to look at how do we work them out together. And so what we're doing, starting in January, is creating something called the Leadership Project. And the Leadership Project is really designed specifically to bring together a number of folk like ourselves, clergy, who are on this journey, who are saying, we know we need different habits and practices, but we need others that we can walk with to begin to discover and learn them together. And so I would encourage you to, if you're interested, take a look at the website, the missionalnetwork.com Leadership Project, see what's there. And if you're interested and want more information, give us your name. You can leave your name on the chat now or send us an email and we'll be in touch with you. So one of our major pieces of engaging these huge questions is going to be the Leadership Project. And we're going to engage these huge questions with small numbers of leaders like ourselves. And we're going to begin to work and wrestle with what they mean in your context and in your life and with your people. Well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the comments, the questions. Always feel like I wish I was in a room with a cup of coffee, talking together and engaged. But for now, this is what we'll do. So whether you're in the US or Canada or the UK, God be with you. And we hope to see you again and talk some more. God's peace. Take care.